So welcome everybody to today's webinar, our final webinar for 2023. It's a bit crazy how quickly this year has gone. But finishing off this year talking about business real property. Obviously, it's not a new subject, but it's a subject that I like to visit on a fairly regular basis because it's a fairly common scenario that we get questions about the use of business real property inside a self-managed super fund and also bringing in business real property to a self-managed fund. So there's always developments in this space. And whilst there's some pretty good information from the ATO with regards to business real property, I think it's an area that's possibly evolving slightly quicker than what the regulatory framework around it is developing. So it's one that we want to make sure that we keep on top of. So reasonable amount of information that I've got contained within the slides to help you through today. So let's jump straight into it and kick things off. So what we're going to do is we'll work through the definition of self-managed super fund, the impact of the ruling SMSF 2009/1, which, as I said, it's a really good ruling for the sense of what it helps provide for us. But there's, I think, some weaknesses as the industry has evolved and as people's decision-making powers around, what and how a business operates and what a business looks like, where I think the ATO have potentially kept up with a lot of that area, but how the scope of that extends to business real property is something for us to be mindful of. So really working through a lot of those key issues and touching on some of the areas like Airbnbs and those sorts of property style arrangements a little bit later within the presentation. So as I said, fair bit to get through. As always, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box as we go along, and hopefully I can get to them. But as you know, if I can't get to them from a time shortage point of view, or they stump me like last month, then I'll make sure that we put the answers in the attaching to the CPD following on from the webinar. So let's jump straight into the definition of business real property. What we'll touch on, obviously, is the key framework around where you may utilise business real property and where the legislative considerations come in. But clearly, the primary issue is what is it and where is it defined? And it is defined in Section 66 of the SIS Act, and it defines that there is any freehold or leasehold interest of the entity in real property or any interest in Crown land other than a leasehold interest of being an interest that is capable of assignment or transfer, or if another class of interest in relation to real property is prescribed by the regulations for the purpose of this paragraph. Any interest belonging to that class. I haven't seen any additional class there. And then the extension of that is where the property is used wholly and exclusively in one or more businesses, whether carried on by the entity or not. So I'm going to touch on that wholly and exclusively throughout the webinar, because that's obviously a core requirement of our definition. So it's an element that we're going to come back to. As we can see from the ATO statistics that I've provided there on the slide, self-managed superannuation funds investing in non-residential real property has been a steady investment, I must say, through the primary reporting period there from the ATO. And historically, when you look at it, and some of us that go back all the way to pre-SMSF days, to the excluded funds days, you had a situation where self-managed super funds back then could invest up to 40% of the fund assets in what was business real property. And then when we had the moving over, or the same year that we moved over to the definition of a self-managed super fund, we adopted a whole lot of legislative change around related party transactions, and at the same time incorporated the capacity for a self-managed super fund to invest ultimately up to 100% of the fund's investments inside of business real property. So going back to 1999, we saw changes, we saw a lot of legislative updates, and of course we then saw a lot of exceptions brought into to the way the legislation operates. So where the legislation does operate in the key elements is that Section 66(5) definition of business real property stems from our acquisition or our prohibition from acquiring assets from related party. And then Section 66 provides us with our exclusions to the prohibition, and it incorporates and says that a fund with analysis no more than 6 members, so it's adopted over or changed over time, adapted over time to accommodate the change to a definition of a self-managed super fund. But funds with no more than 5 members can acquire business real property from a self-managed superannuation fund. Now, by extension, we then go through and look at, as I talked about before, the related party rules that came in from 99 as well. And with those were some of the legislative changes that were incorporated into the definition of an in-house asset. And of course, the definition of an in-house asset includes an asset subject to a lease or a lease arrangement between the trustees of the self-managed super fund and a related party of that fund. So then we then have a further legislative reference to business real property, and that is we have our in-house asset exclusions, and paragraph 71 1A to 1J provide the investments that are excluded from being in-house assets. And of course, the 2 significant exclusions there are business real property of a self-managed super fund that is subject to a lease or a lease arrangement enforceable by legal proceedings between the SMSF trustee and a related party of the fund. So that's our standard business real property lease. And then we've got our investments made by a related company or trust. So without going through verbatim the wording of the legislative requirements there, it is our Div 13.3A, often referred to as a 13.22C unit trust or company, where that unit trust or company invests in business real property. Then that business real property can also be leased to a related party. And again, so the very quick history of all of that was when they expanded the business real property requirements from 40% to 100%, basically the legislative material supporting that stated that we don't want to discriminate with how that property is held. And so when they'd already at the same time incorporated rules around investments in a related trust or investments in a related company, they incorporated this exception into Div 13.3A to say that if the asset of the company or trust is business real property, then it is also exempt from the in-house asset rule. So we can indeed lease, and say the word lend, we can lease business real property to a related party if that property is held via a related trust. So we have our 2 effectively significant piece of legislation around business real property. One is the capacity for the super fund to acquire it from a related party. So knowing whether or not a property meets the definition of business real property at point of acquisition, and then the capacity from an ongoing leasing point of view to ensure that if it's leased to a related party, that it is meeting the definition of business real property. And, I'll talk through some of the nuances of the ruling as I go through the webinar. And one of the key things and one of the questions that's often raised in this from a conversation point of view is that because Section 66 is exclusively testing the asset at the time of acquisition, it's the whole concept of, well, does the asset need to have met the definition of business real property prior to the acquisition, and does the asset need to continue to meet the definition of business real property following the acquisition of the asset? And what the ATO tend to focus on in that regard is ultimately, they're looking both sides of the transaction to ensure that you're not just trying to manipulate the legislation. Of course, there are anti-avoidance provisions inside Section 66 as well, so that you haven't entered into a scheme to be able to get around the acquisition of asset rules. So really, they want to ensure that there is some continuity of that investment continuing to meet the definition of business real property. But that's not to suggest that the nature of the property can't change over time. It's just ultimately that the intention when you're acquiring it is that it is going to be business real property. So that's a little bit of the history stuff to be mindful of, and a few of the key issues for us to talk through today. So SMSF ruling 2009/1, it's crazy, and I often see these these various social media posts or whatever, when someone says we're talking about 20 years ago, and people, certainly people my age, reflect back to the 1980s, whereas actually 20 years ago is obviously 2003. And I know that because that was when my son was born. But the reality is that a lot of these rulings, these SMSF rulings, sort of came in that period. 2008, 2009 were probably the two most significant years for a lot of rulings. And so we've been operating with regards to how things such as business real property is defined for quite some time. But of course, a lot has happened in the world in the ensuing 14 years. And so it's important that documents like SMSF 2009-1 are regularly reviewed by the ATO and indeed challenged by the industry. And it's fair to say that this ruling has gone through a couple of changes, but probably not enough in regards to some of the areas. And I think one of the issues, which I'll touch on a little bit later, which is obviously renewable energy, and a question that we often get about solar panels. And so I've got a couple of examples there that I'm going to work through with you. You know, we're talking, when we start to talk about fixtures and chattels and things like that with regards to business real property, you know, I think it's still a bit of a problem situation. And whilst there's been some court cases in regards to whether certain renewable energy elements such as wind farms and that are fixtures, there have been some court cases on it. Interestingly enough, there's been two significant ones, and one identified that they were a fixture and the other identified that they weren't a fixture. So, you know, there's issues associated with that, which suggests that it's problematic when we're looking at self-managed super funds to then contemplate certain elements that we would potentially want to incorporate with our property, such as means to access renewable energy. But where does that sit with regards to the property is a little bit of an unknown quantity with regards to the regulator. So, as I said, ruling 2009-1, it does provide us with a guidance with regards to the meaning and how we apply the business real property in relation to self-managed superannuation funds. And as I stated before, it's primarily for two purposes, one being the acquisition or the exceptions to the prohibition on acquiring assets from a related party, and the other one is to ensure that the investment is not treated as an in-house asset, because, you know, the consequences of it being treated as an in-house asset is that there's very little scope to rectify it, and this is an ongoing conversation that's been around for forever and ever and a day. Is if you breach the in-house asset provisions, then the legislation is relatively clear about what your requirement is, and that is your requirement is to put in place a written plan as to how you're going to dispose of the asset, and to ensure that you don't breach the in-house asset. So rectifying the arrangement to make sure it meets the definition of business real property again, or to remove the related party, doesn't actually satisfy the requirements of the in-house asset rules, which talk about disposal of the asset. So you're going to end up engaging in what would otherwise be, I'd suspect, a fairly drawn out process with the regulator with regards to whether or not the investment can be retained in the fund. So let's look at a couple of the key issues and conditions that need to be met. So we have to meet two primary conditions, and then there are conditions within those conditions. But I'm not going to dig too deep down. That's more of a masterclass kind of conversation versus a 1 hour webinar. But the first condition is that the SMSF or another entity must hold an eligible interest in real property. Now, where we talk about the SMSF or the other entity, when we're talking about those two key different entities, one references the leasing arrangement. So the SMSF must hold interest or eligible interest in real property from a leasing point of view to related parties. And then the other entity must hold an eligible interest in real property for an SMSF to be able to acquire it from that party. So again, as I said, everything that we talk about today is in the scope of either Section 66 acquisition rules or 71 the in-house asset rules. And then that interest must be, as defined before, freehold, leasehold, or various elements of Crown land. And I've got some definitions and that for you with regards to those concepts coming up in a moment. And then the second piece of the puzzle is that the underlying land must satisfy the business use test, which requires that the property be used wholly and exclusively for one or more businesses. And so, again, I said I'd be coming back and regularly contemplating wholly and exclusively through the webinar. So that is the second condition. One is that we're holding an eligible interest in real property, and that real property is freehold, leasehold, or certain Crown land. And then it must satisfy the business use test, which is the wholly and exclusively. So again, without going into to each of these in any sort of real depth, you've got your freehold interest, your leasehold interest, and your Crown land there. You've got those definitions there available for your own perusal. But majority of SMSF transactions that I've seen, certainly over the last 20 odd years, are ultimately freehold interest. I have seen one or two leasehold interests, and of course, what the leasehold interest provides us with is exclusivity of access ultimately to the element of the land that is a leasehold interest. So it's an area that, as I said, is less frequent in the SMSF space, but does apply. And when I'm talking in school, then as far as Crown land is concerned, and SMSF's acquiring business real property that satisfies that definition of Crown land, then it's one that I certainly haven't actually seen in practice, but again, haven't come across every single SMSF out there. So clearly there was scope for it to apply. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had it sitting inside of the legislation. So what we obviously have to determine is that we have to determine firstly that we hold that eligible interest in real property, so that leasehold, freehold interest. And then once we've done that, then we have to work through the requirements of the wholly and exclusively in one or more businesses. And noting that it doesn't have to be the business of the entity that holds the land necessarily for it to satisfy that condition. From a regulatory point of view, like the ATO are going to look at the entirety of the circumstances, so that when they want to make an assessment, if it goes to an ATO point of view, so if you're going for SMSF specific advice, so one of the key things is that you can't apply to the ATO for certain rulings, as in you can't determine whether or not something is business real property, but you can sort of get through their SMSF specific advice piece, you can go through the concept, and if you provide all the details and identify that the land is business real property, then you're going to get that advice support from them. But they're often not as clear, and that's probably not the right choice of word, but they're often, I think, a little bit more, they sit on the fence a bit more in the SMSF specific advice piece with regards to making clear definitive positions on whether something is or isn't business real property. And so often it might be that you have to look at challenging them on other elements, such as a case that I'm going to raise in a moment for you, where instead of challenging the ATO in regards to whether something satisfied the definition of business real property, they went down the other path, and that is whether or not they were carrying on a business. And the ATO rejected that, but then they took it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal determined they were carrying on a business, and so therefore that meant that the properties attached to that business were business real property. So people go about things in a roundabout kind of way. So we have to look at all of the circumstances when determining what we can do. And then it is the underlying land that is what we then need to determine that is being used in regards to that business real property. So three that often come up as obvious scenarios is residential property, and ultimately there's very limited scope as to whether or not residential property is going to be business real property. Certainly from a property investment point of view, it's far less likely unless you're involved in all of the ongoing management, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a moment. Land development, so when you're developing land, then if you're in the business of land development, then the land that you're effectively using in those businesses to do the property developments on can, in certain circumstances, satisfy the conditions of business real property. Again, I certainly have seen in my time scenarios where, particularly from an audit point of view, the auditors have been quite sceptical about whether or not that land would satisfy the definition, and so I've challenged the trustees to seek further advice, and often that further advice is going beyond the legal opinion that they've got from potentially parties that don't have that full SMSF experience. But I've certainly seen land utilised for property development purposes be considered as business real property. And then, of course, the other one is vacant land, and the vacant land question is often sort of raised in regards to, okay, what is the vacant land representing? I mean, if it's vacant land in regards to business or property development, then maybe it comes under that land development scenario there. But if it's vacant land that sits alongside existing business premises, then what is the use of that land? And is there that wholly and exclusively sort of element attached to it as well? So when we talk about things such as utilising vacant land for car parking spaces for business purposes, then there is scope to use it if it's mapped out as such. But I'm going to run through a couple of examples with regards to that as we go through the session. So again, when we talk about wholly and exclusively, we have to look at these words independently, but collectively as well. So we're looking at any use of the land and then all the uses of the land. So when we're saying the any bit, so that's the wholly, and then the all is the exclusively, has to be measured against the business use test. Now, when we're talking about wholly and exclusively, the ATO recognise that there is a practical element to this that has to be considered, and from a practical element point of view, what needs to be identified there is that the land, to the capacity for it to be used, is being used. So it's being used to, in the ATO's word, to an appreciable degree for the purposes of business use. And then from an exclusivity point of view, with regards to that, once we identify that the land is being used to the degree that it needs to be used to meet that wholly consideration, then we look at the exclusivity element and identify, okay, well, there's going to be certain sort of insignificant, inconsequential arrangements where there might be some trifling non-business use of the property. And in that instance, then the definition is not going to fail. And often the examples that are used, and often the examples that I use there, is it's not uncommon that you might sometimes store some of your personal belongings in your work office on a short-term basis, because I don't know, you're moving house or doing something like that. Well, that's not going to change the definition away from the wholly and exclusively arrangement. However, if you have storage facilities in your business premises and you use that on a full-time basis to store your personal items, then all of a sudden you've lost that exclusivity. So again, it's not sort of it's not minor, it's not insignificant. It's actually taking away from that exclusive nature. So it's one that people ultimately need to be mindful of. And similarly, the one that we see, and some of us would have been guilty of this in our time, is sometimes you might work a little bit too hard, and so I've seen this from officers' point of view, is that people have slept overnight in their office because they've got a couch in there and they can convert that couch into a bed to sleep there. Well, if that is a minor use, then that's one thing. Whereas if you set up effectively a bedroom type arrangement inside of your business premises for the purposes of sleeping, because you are more than irregularly going to stay there, then you're going to have a problem with the arrangement that you've got meeting that definition of exclusivity. But of course, there's always in every scenario exceptions to the rule, and the big exception with regards to the non-business use is that exception that sits around the definition of business real property and primary production. And if it is used in a primary production business such as a farm, then the wholly and exclusively test can be met, even if there is a dwelling that is used for private or domestic purposes. So this is the one exception that is ultimately built into the legislation, so it's not relying on SMSF ruling 2009-1. That dwelling must be in an area of land no more than 2 hectares, and the main use of the whole property can't be for domestic or private purposes. So ultimately, where you've got your farmland and you're running the farming business and you are living on the farm, then the primary purpose of having that farm is to generate income. Then it's not going to take away from satisfying that definition of business real property if you meet those conditions of no more than 2 hectares, which is a fairly significant private dwelling if you're looking from a size point of view. So there are some key issues with regards to that primary production definition that people need to be mindful of. And I've got there for you just the definition, again, straight out of the ruling, but the ruling is referencing the Income Tax Assessment Act, and we have what is a primary production business, and what that would certainly qualify for. I was interested when sort of putting everything together to you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation of this, but when determining all of the fishing elements there in the Belche de Mer, that's what I'm going to roll with anyhow, is the French word for sea cucumbers, which I'm not sure why in the Australian legislation we couldn't just reference sea cucumbers, albeit that I also heard an interesting fact somewhere recently that most international law, or in fact all international law, is written in French. So maybe that's where the ATO get that from. So you can put that well and truly in your why did you bother telling us that piece, Tim. But yeah, so obviously we've got a definition of what primary production business is, and then we need to ensure that from a primary production business that we are then actually operating a business. And there's a link within the slides there. Once you've got a copy of the slides, that references the ATO page. It says you're not operating a business if the activity is better described as a hobby, a form of recreation, or a sporting activity. So obviously hobby farming is one that people need to be mindful of, that it's not going to satisfy the definition of business real property. And again, not only this ruling, but multiple other ATO documents go through the process of what carrying on a business is. And so if that is the primary concern of your clients, then I would think they would need to go through that whole process of identifying, firstly, if they're carrying on a business, to determine whether or not they would satisfy the requirements of business real property. So just a couple of things to be mindful of there. And then when we're talking about primary production, what we then have to take into consideration, we actually take this into consideration with regards to all elements of any property transaction, but certainly relevant when we're dealing with farming land, is whether or not the crops on the land are, and again, here I go with my Latin, but the fructus naturalis or fructus industrialis, to determine whether or not they form part of the land, or whether they're an annualized crop, and require sort of that element of agriculture to produce the crop. So those that are planted and permanent, obviously the planting process is just a fairly small scale part of the entire process. But then after that point in time, so your fruit trees, your vineyards, and that, they would come under the naturalis and they would form part of the land. Whereas your agricultural crops, so the sowing and the reaping side of things, the hay, wheat, oat, sunflower, etc., all those other examples that are provided up the top there, they would not form part of the actual value. So as far as when you're transferring the property in, that wouldn't be forming part of the transaction in itself. And so then we get to the situation of determining that we've got, okay, well, we've identified in many instances that we have to meet this wholly and exclusively requirement. And I guess primary production is also a really good example of that, because, there might be, significant number of land parcels incorporated into that one piece of business real property, and not all of that land is used for business purposes, potentially because if you grow crops, it might not be suitable for the growing of crops as such, but it forms part of the various land titles or whatever. Well, that's not going to diminish its definition from being business real property. But if you were using that land for multiple non-business purposes other than the primary dwelling as such, then that could potentially be an issue for the fund in that regard. So they're just the sort of issues, and without sort of going off on a tangent, business real property and limited recourse borrowing arrangements, you obviously have to be fairly careful with regards to the single acquirable asset element, because whilst we can transfer an investment in under the definition of business real property, if we're going to try and acquire it from a related party under a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, then we also have to meet the definition of a single acquirable asset, and then it's going to come down to the capacity for those various titles to actually be sold independently of each other, and if they can technically be sold independently, then it's not going to be able to be done under a single limited recourse borrowing arrangement, but would require multiple arrangements to be put in place. So anyway, we then need to look at the connection required between the business use and there being an actual business. And so we need to have that link between the business use test and the property for us to be able to, one, contemplate the acquisition rules, but then also determine the in-house asset exceptions as well. So these are all of the requirements that we would factor in. And I referenced before, like the things such as vacant land, and we've seen examples of it from the commissioner's point of view, that if we've got, say, permitting employees to park their cars on business premises, then that would potentially make a vacant block of land business real property, and also other elements that would not restrict property from being business real property. And we talked about the primary production exclusion there for the 2 hectares. Well, there's also examples about talking about security guards on business premises, but also hotel managers or the like, potentially bed and breakfast, where you've got that 24-hour on-call requirement. Well, the fact that there is effectively a residential componentry to those investments does not necessarily take away from the fact that something is business real property. But again, once you start going down that path, then I think it's far more important to engage, certainly, if not with a legal opinion, then most definitely with the ATO from a regulatory point of view. So let's look at a couple of examples to work through. And a couple of these are taken out of the ruling, but then a couple of them are also taken out of court cases and just other examples that we've put together there. So example 8 from the SMSF 2009-1 talks about Andrew and Carolyn, who own a vacant block of land which is zoned for business use. And I think that's probably a good point to interject and make the reference that zoning does not dictate whether or not something is business real property. And so, whilst I'm going on a little bit about it from a point of view of getting the message across, it's not what something is, it's how something's used that will determine whether or not it is going to be a business property. And so we all have the examples, and many of you may even exist in these examples, where you see accounting firms, financial advising firms, legal firms, medical practices that are old houses converted into to business premises. And so if those premises are used exclusively for business purposes, then they would satisfy the definition of business real property. So the zoning of residential or part residential, part commercial, or exclusively commercial use is not what dictates it. It's going to be what the actual use is. So in this instance, the land is zoned for business purposes, and their son, who lives near it, asks mum and dad whether or not he can park his trucks and other machineries that he uses his business on that vacant block. But he doesn't have a lease, and he makes no payments to mum and dad in that instance. And mum and dad, Andrew and Caroline, are looking to contribute the vacant block into the self-managed superannuation fund. So firstly, we have to look at the two conditions. And condition one is it an eligible interest in real property? And the answer is yes, it is. Then the second part is it used wholly and exclusively in a business, right? So the fact that it is zone business is not what's relevant there. It's what, in this instance, Flynn is using it for, and he's not using it wholly, or they're not using it wholly and exclusively for Flynn's business. Now, if, for example, there was fencing around it and Flynn was paying lease commercial rates of over a lease to store his business assets, his equipment, his trucks and that on that property, then, and it was on a permanent basis, then you would say it would meet the definition. But in this instance, because it's sort of it's not regular use, it's just on the odd occasion, then the commissioner would say that it doesn't satisfy the definition of business real property. So in this instance, it wouldn't take a lot for them to be able to actually convert it to business real property. So it's one that would obviously be taken into consideration. And of course, the one that's been raised a lot more in recent years is this concept of short-term accommodation. And of course, we've now got the whole peer-to-peer marketplace. So, all of us would have looked at some point in time online and looked at Airbnb stays, bookings.com, just to name the ones that I've certainly looked at in my time, and they're offering short-term accommodation. And so then the question comes into it, well, okay, well, if I'm using this accommodation as short-term accommodation, am I running a business? Now, what we need to look at there is there's a number of obviously things that the tax office are going to look at. But again, it comes back to that link that I referenced before as to whether or not you are carrying on a business within the ATO website there, and issues such as, are you preparing and maintaining the property? So are you involved in ensuring that the property is ready for the next lot of guests that are coming in, managing the listings, the pricings, the calendar, so when it's available, when it's not available, and as a bit of a tip in regards to this, you'd probably want to be making it, for it to be at least considered as carrying on a business, you want it to be to be available on a 24/7 365-day sort of process for you, even to get close to satisfying that definition of whether you're carrying on a business of short-term accommodation. But your concepts around your marketing, advertising, the booking inquiries, reservations, cancellations, welcoming guests, providing support during stays, all these sorts of things are included in the concept of short-term accommodation. And so then there's the factors that flow across with regards to the definition of what carrying on a business is. And then, of course, are you doing it all yourself, or is there a hosting service? Is somebody else providing that service? So a number of other elements that come into consideration. And so if we look at the situation of David, who owns a 2-bedroom property, which is available for short-term accommodation throughout the year, does advertise through multiple platforms, manages all aspects of the property himself, does not live or stay at the property, and earns about $60,000 a year. So the question that we actually have to then ask is David running a short-term accommodation business? So this is quintessentially what's going to be required for determining. So we know that we've got an interest in real property. So David owns the property. So we've got an interest in real property. So then the second piece is the wholly and exclusively for business purposes. So the question that is asked often first is there sufficient scale? Is it regular? Is it repetitive? So there are examples again within the SMSF ruling that I would urge you to go and look at. And then we've got the private binding ruling guidance. So the ATO have actually got guidance for those that are seeking private binding rulings with regards to carrying on a business of letting rental properties. So they actually outline there all of the information that you would need to provide. Now, of course, if David owned just this 2-bedroom property, you would say that he hasn't or isn't carrying on a business as such, and he would be unable to highlight it. But I want to bring your attention to this scenario, Alzam's Trust and Allen and Commissioner of Tax. So this is the same parties, and this is the individual, the taxpayer in his personal capacity, which is Allen and the Commissioner, and then the taxpayer in their capacity of the trustees of a trust, which is the Alzam's Trust. Now, between these two entities, so between the individual and the trust, he owned 14 properties. 9 of them were held individually, and the other 5 were held via the trust. Now, the tax office determined, and this is one of those scenarios where he wanted to look to transfer the property into the self-managed superannuation fund under the definition of business real property. Now, the tax office refused to rule on the SMSF side of things, because you would need to go through the SMSF specific advice process rather than the income tax piece. So he applied for a private binding ruling, which is the application of income tax legislation, and the ATO denied that he would satisfy that definition. So he actually appealed this. So went to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and wanted to get a reversal. Now, ultimately, this spanned out over like 2015 through to 2019 from a time frame point of view. Now, in that time, from 2015, 2016, and 2017, Mr. Allen was also an employee elsewhere. And then he was retrenched, or made redundant from that employment at the end of 2017, and then from 2018 to 2019, all this work was done exclusively by Mr. Allen. So the AAT, they actually found in favour of Mr. Allen for 2018 and 2019 because they looked at the fact that it was the only work that he was doing, but because he was engaged in all elements of it, other than effectively the advertising piece, all other management componentry was being done. They said that yes, he was carrying on a business, but they refused to rule on the 2015 to 2017. But the fact that they ruled on 2018 and 2019, which was the time frame when he was looking to transfer the property into the self-managed super fund, then they're saying he's carrying on a business. So therefore, it would conceivably meet that definition of business real property, and therefore he'd be able to acquire the asset from himself or from the asset from the trust as far as business real property goes. But I just want to stop there and highlight sort of a key element of that, and that is just because the legislation gives him the all clear to acquire that under Section 66, to say it's an exception to the rule, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually able to acquire that asset and transfer it into the self-managed super fund. And that's because overriding all of this is, of course, the sole purpose test. And you've got to ask the question is why is he looking to transfer that property into, at least one of those properties, into the self-managed superannuation fund, right? Is it to provide for retirement benefits for himself? So the question's got to be asked is how will that property, that what is ultimately a bit of residential property, how is that going to benefit him in retirement? And he might have some justifiable reasons there. But secondly, is it being brought in for the sake of tax minimisation, because he operates these businesses outside of the super environment in a personal tax environment, and so therefore all of the income is taxed at marginal tax rates rather than taxed at a concessional rate inside the superannuation fund. And so this is where it's a little bit like the Aussie golfer scenario, where the ATO deemed that ultimately, or they thought they'd breached the sole purpose test. They went down that path. The courts held otherwise and said it wasn't a breach of the sole purpose test, but it was then subsequently a breach of the in-house asset rules. So in this instance, there's no question about him leasing the asset to a related party. That wasn't ever actually what was occurring. It was more about the acquisition piece. But then you've got to ask the question, in my opinion, from the side of things as the sole purpose test as well. So we do need to to be mindful there. But this shows you that that there is the capacity for properties that meet that definition of residential property to be transferred into the fund. And then again, as I've sort of touched on when I referenced the element of the sole purpose test, but once it's in the self-managed superannuation fund, right, we've then got to work through the whole investment strategy. So, how much of the fund does it represent? That making sure that there's no related party use. That was the issue with Aussie Golfer. Then we've got the issues around non-arm's length expenditure. So if he is undertaking all of this work, right, then he's got to be now remembering and noting that he's been classified as carrying on a business. So then you wouldn't be able to say that you're undertaking any of that work in your capacity as trustee. You'd be undertaking that work in your capacity as a property manager. So therefore, if the fund isn't paying any expenses associated with that, then you're going to have non-arm's length expenditure. We know that that's obviously a fairly hot topic at the moment. But again, it means from an ongoing point, there's a whole lot of things that we have to factor in, other insurance costs. So then you've got to work out, is this an appropriate investment to hold inside a self-managed superannuation fund? So even though the scope of what we're talking about is whether or not something meets the definition of business real property, the question then really should come about as to, well, should we actually be transferring that business real property into the self-managed superannuation fund? And I think that question is often overlooked when we dig through to the actual reasons as to why people go down this path. And I do a lot of work in this space with regards to working through the rules around making contributions to funds and the whole acquisition of assets from a related party. And there's certainly no doubt with the scope of, say, business succession and other things that it's beneficial to potentially look at transferring business property, certainly the family business property, inside a self-managed super fund from a tax concessional point of view, from an asset protection point of view, with regards to if something occurs to the business itself, but then also from a contributions cap point of view, because that the lease money, as long as you're paying that lease on commercial terms, then that lease money is contributing to the future benefit of the members of the fund. And if you've got the dynasty in there, the family in there, where you've got parents and then potentially children coming through at some point in time, then it makes a lot of sense. Certainly if you've got someone closing in on retirement where you have to start to contemplate pensions, then the whole business real property transfer may not necessarily be appropriate. And of course, again, I don't want to go too deep down this path, but needless to say, it will no doubt be one of our webinars in the 2024 year, which is our Div 296 tax, and those with total superannuation balances more than $3 million. One of the key issues that there's been a little bit of argy-bargy about in the press recently is referencing to how many self-managed super funds or how many farms are owned inside self-managed superannuation funds, and how many of them are going to be impacted by the Div 296 measure. And so, that's not the only issue associated with those funds, and that is, do they have the liquidity? And part of the argument that is being raised to talk about the Div 296 is saying that they don't have the liquidity to pay out the tax liability because from a fund point of view, the value is in the capital value rather than the actual returns. And so then you've got to say, well, okay, from an SMSF point of view, where's that sitting with regards to the ability for it to pay retirement benefits to the members as well? So a little bit of a catch-22 situation, but I don't want to digress into Div 296 because I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot more in the 2024 year. One of the things that we have to factor in, so we looked a little bit about our crops and our primary production land situation. We've obviously looked a little bit at the short-term accommodation, but then the next piece that I wanted to touch on is that renewable energy, or the concept of clean energy or whatever, and a lot more people are taking interest in those sorts of issues. But to do that, we have to appreciate that business real property includes fixtures, right? So anything that forms part of the land versus chattels. So anything that doesn't form part of the land as such, and is not effectively a permanent fixture to the land, so it's only held on the land by its weight necessarily, then that doesn't form part of the business rule property. And so you've got these two tests that you have to satisfy, one being the degree of annexation, and then the object of the annexation test. And so again, without sort of spending too much time working through each of these definitions, you know, the concept of annexation comes down to ultimately, if removing certain fixtures or certain elements from the land, if it's going to destroy the land, destroy the value, come at and the cost to remove it is worth more than the value of the land, then ultimately it doesn't, it's not going to form part of the fixtures of land. Whereas if there's some permanency to it, and you know, the classic example that I've often used in this space is the example of a caravan park. Now, if a caravan park, which is business rule property, wishes to be transferred into a self-managed super fund, well, then there's going to be elements of that caravan park that cannot be sold as part of that transaction. And it might be, you know, certain playground elements. There might be those big, you see a lot of these big bouncy castle type things in these caravan parks that wouldn't form part of it. But those cabins that have been effectively built on foundations and have been connected permanently to the water and the electricity, you know, as opposed to the various sort of portable sites, then that would form part of the fixture. So there's a bit of work to be done in that space. And so that's where we start to talk about like clean energy and business rule property. Like, where do things like solar panels fit with regards to the degree of annexation and the object of annexation? Because technically they can be removed quite easily. And so, you know, there's this argument that I would say that if you look at those court cases, and I just sort of touched on them from a reference point of view, that talked about wind farms, and we had the Supreme Court of New South Wales saying that I think they were saying that they weren't a fixture, and then the courts in Victoria were saying they were a fixture. Well, we're going to need to see a little bit more sort of comfort in that space before I think we can say with any clarity that things like solar panels form part of the business rule property with regards to acquiring property for a self-managed superannuation fund. Now, where does that mean we sit with regards to transferring property in? Like, if you're looking at property to be transferred in, and you transfer the premises in, and it's got solar panels attached to the roof, is that actually going to mean that the fund doesn't, or the asset doesn't satisfy the definition of business rule property? I wouldn't go straight outright and say that would be the case. But if we look at things like over the time water licenses and other things, then there is effectively precedents set by the ATO where we could see at some point in time that things such as solar panels will not be considered to be part of the premises, and in which instance then a separate arrangement has to be entered into. Now, the issue here is that if they are treated as a separate asset and then they form part of, say, a lease to a related party, then they're going to sit under the definition of an in-house asset as well. And so we've got a potential problem to factor in there. So, you know, I'm putting my hand up when I start to introduce this concept about things like clean energy to say that I don't actually have the answers. I don't think the industry has a definitive position on this that you can take any great comfort in. And so often what I sort of come down to is the question that is asked is whether or not the super fund should be effectively paying for the installation of solar panels, or whether the tenant should be looking at the installation bit. And you know, I have often lent on the side of saying, well, I think that's a tenant issue to consider. However, in saying that, normally if a tenant is fitting it out, then they would have the make good provisions potentially within the lease. So to suggest that the super fund, if a super fund does install it, if it's a non-related party, you're not going to have any issues there. But if the super fund does install it, then that's obviously got to be reflected in the lease, because there is going to be a discount provided on the electricity. So that means maybe potentially the leasing that you're paying is going to be more. So all of these sorts of issues need to effectively be taken into consideration. And so, I say with references to all of these elements of clean energy, is that we need to be mindful as to it doesn't necessarily satisfy the definition, firstly, of a fixture, and therefore it wouldn't satisfy the definition of business real property. So tread carefully and potentially seek advice and regulatory advice where people are contemplating it, because now it's going beyond solar panels. I mean, yes, we're talking, there's cases about wind farms. Solar panels are popular from an SMSF point of view, but we're also now looking at electric vehicle charging stations and attaching them to the side of premises or whatever, and that's clearly going to also fit into this same area of the regulator needs to I guess undertake a little bit of work to give some certainty to this space to within the industry, because you can do yourself quite a decent Google search on this, and you won't find anything definitive. You can even go into the ATO community pages where people have raised the question, and the answer that comes back from the ATO is very generic. And then what unfortunately would happen then is people will go to other external forums, and having read through many of those forums myself, you will get every answer conceivable as to what you can and can't do inside a self-managed super fund, and none of those answers are provided by anyone that is appropriately qualified to provide advice in that space. And I would suggest that most people wouldn't be qualified to do it. So going through the regulator is clearly the primary requirement. So ultimately, my takeaways for this is that it's important that we understand that there is this business use test, and that we are satisfying the definition of wholly and exclusively. So if there is any ongoing non-business use inside of a property, then you can consider it not a property that's worthy of being transferred in from a business real property point of view. If we are looking at primary production land, then it's important to understand how that exception to the rules work with the 2 hectares, and that it doesn't take away from the primary use of the land, which is that operation under the primary production business. As I said right up front, one of the key issues is that right from the outset, the government made a position very clear that said it didn't matter how you hold business real property, that the rules would apply equally across either measure. So either directly, you can have 100%, or through a related unit trust or a company, you can have 100% in that business premises, and it's still subject to the in-house asset exception if it is leased to a related party on commercial terms. So there is greater capacity to deal with it there. The one thing I will say about that, to sort of as a side note and a finishing note, is when we reference non-arm's length income, if you breach the non-arm's length income for a business property that you hold directly inside the self-managed fund, then you can rectify non-arm's length incomes and just have the tax whack in 1 year. As long as it's not a capital expense, then you can have that one issue and move on. If you do that inside a trust, then you are going to have huge issues, because if you do it inside a 1322C, then all transactions must be done on arm's length. And if they don't, then you breach 1322C, and that is going to be a huge problem. And that ruling is very much a good guidance and starting point for access to this information. So a question just to finish off with there. Are there any borrowing issues? As I said, the primary borrowing issue subject to what you're looking to borrow to do is that you've got the LRBA issue with regards to if it's a single acquirable asset or not. So as I mentioned before, if you're looking to do an LRBA over a property that's over multiple titles, then does it meet that definition of a single acquirable asset? We know that if there's permanent fixture over multiple titles, then that would restrict the capacity to split those titles and make it easier to borrow over it. But if there's no restrictions to splitting those titles up, then you're going to have an issue with satisfying that definition of a single acquirable asset, and that would be a problem for the fund. So it is time for us to take a bit of a break. As I said, we'll be coming back and I will be delivering these presentations on behalf of or for and on behalf of SuperGuardian. Again, we'll kick these off most likely in February. We normally take a break from the webinars in that January period, where a lot of people take leave. So I wish you all the best over the holiday period if you're taking time off, and if, like myself, you're continuing to work, then take it easy, have a few moments to yourself, and I look forward to catching up with you all in the new year. So thanks for attending, and look out for your CPD and a copy of the presentations that will come through in the next couple of days. So thanks for attending, and I'll see you all in 2024.